I walked into the shop to bury the name of the woman who broke my heart, but the artist behind the counter took one look at my shoulder and slid the form back. "I don't do names," she said coldly. "Find another shop." I turned to leave, trapped with my ex's permanent mistake burning on my skin. But before I reached the door, she called out. And what she did instead? The bell above the door chimed, and Grace Whitmore stepped into velvet rose tattoo with her ex-girlfriend's name still burned into her skin, and a heart full of hope that today would be the day she finally got rid of it. The shop smelled like antiseptic and sandalwood. Black and white flash art lined the walls in neat rows, but Grace barely noticed any of it. Her eyes found the woman behind the counter immediately, because it was impossible to look anywhere else. Vivian Hartley stood with her back half-turned, one glove down, adjusting a lamp over the tattoo station, her dark hair pulled back in a loose knot, the full sleeve of roses and thorns on her left arm catching the light as she moved. Grace cleared her throat. "Hi, I have an appointment." "For a cover-up?" Vivian turned. Her eyes were gray-green, sharp as a scalpel, and they swept over Grace once before dropping to the intake form on the counter. "Name?" "Grace Whitmore." "Not your name." Vivian's voice was flat, patient in the way a person is patient with a child who doesn't understand instructions. "The name you want covered." Grace felt her face heat. She pulled her right shoulder forward slightly, a protective instinct she hadn't shaken in the 5 years since Alex first put her name there. "Alex. It says Alex." Vivian picked up the form and read it in silence. The only sound was the hum of the sterilizer in the corner. When she looked up, her expression hadn't changed, but something behind her eyes had gone hard and distant. She set the form down and slid it back across the counter. "I don't do names. Find another shop." Grace blinked. "Wait, I have an appointment. I booked it 3 weeks ago. The deposit? Keep the deposit." Vivian was already turning away, reaching for a spray bottle to wipe down her surface that was already clean. "I'm not the artist for you, please." The word came out smaller than Grace intended, and she hated herself for it. She hated the way her voice cracked on the second syllable, hated the way her fingers found the hem of her sweater and started twisting, but she couldn't leave. She had been working up the courage to do this for months. She had drawn the design on scrap paper 100 times, erased it, redrawn it. She had told herself that once it was gone, once Alex's name was buried under something beautiful, she could finally start to breathe again. "I can do a different design," she said, stepping forward. "I have a reference. A camellia. I thought maybe the petals could flow over the letters and the stem could curve along the—" "I said I don't do names." Vivian's voice didn't rise, but it dropped half an octave. And somehow that was worse. "It's not about the design. I don't cover names. I don't cover initials. I don't cover any symbol of permanence that someone else put on your body without earning it." Grace's throat tightened. "She didn't put it on me without earning it. I asked her to. I wanted it." Vivian stopped wiping the counter. She didn't look up, but her hands stilled, and for a moment the silence between them was heavy enough to feel. "Then you should have asked her to keep it too." She set the spray bottle down and finally met Grace's eyes. "Skin isn't a chalkboard. You don't get to erase the past just because it stopped being convenient." The words hit Grace like a slap. She stood there in the middle of the shop, her hands shaking at her sides, her ex-girlfriend's name burning against her shoulder blade like it had just been inked an hour ago. She wanted to argue. She wanted to explain that it wasn't about convenience, and that Alex had left her for someone else, that she had spent the past years sleeping in the middle of the bed because she couldn't stand the empty space where another body used to be. But she didn't say any of that. She just nodded, swallowed the lump in her throat, and said, "Okay, I understand. Sorry for wasting your time." She turned and walked toward the door, her sneakers squeaking on the polished concrete. She was halfway through the door when she heard the voice behind her. "Wait." Grace stopped. She didn't turn round. "The camellia." Vivian's voice was quieter now, almost reluctant. "Did you draw it yourself?" Grace swallowed. "Yeah. It's not very good. I'm not an artist." "It's fine." A pause. "The petals are right, but the stem is too thin. It would look like it was bleeding into the letters." Grace turned slowly. Vivian was standing behind the counter with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable, but she wasn't looking at Grace. She was looking at the design sketch that Grace had left on the counter without realizing it. "Come back tomorrow," Vivian said, still not looking at her. "Same time, I'll see what I can do." Grace opened her mouth to say thank you, but the words got tangled in her throat. She managed a small nod instead, then slipped out the door before Vivian could change her mind. The bell chomped again as the door closed behind her. Vivian stood alone in the shop, staring at the sketch of the camellia. After a long moment, she reached up and touched her right shoulder, where a faded scar lay hidden beneath her sleeve, a scar shaped like a rose that had been burned off a long time ago. She didn't realize she had been holding her breath until the phone rang, and she let it out in a rush. The next morning, Grace stood outside Velvet Rose Tattoo for a full 3 minutes before she worked up the courage to open the door. She had barely slept. The sketchbook in her hands felt heavier than it should, and she had redrawn the camellia 4 times before she was satisfied with the curve of the petals. She was not a painter. She was a bookseller who arranged displays and wrote handwritten recommendations. But last night, alone in her small apartment above the bookstore, she had let herself draw something that was not a cover design or a shelf label. She had drawn a flower, petal by petal, as if she were rebuilding herself from the inside out. The bell chimed when she pushed the door open. The shop smelled like antiseptic and fresh coffee, a strange combination that should have been off-putting but somehow felt honest. Vivian was already there, standing at the counter with a mug in her hand, her black half-gloves in place. She looked up when Grace entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "You came back," Vivian said. It was not a question. "I brought a new design." Grace stepped forward and placed the sketchbook on the counter, open to the page she had finished at 2 a.m. "I don't want to cover the name. I want it to become a flower." Vivian set down her mug and picked up the sketchbook. She studied the drawing in silence, her expression unreadable. Grace watched her fingers trace the pencil lines, noticed how steady they were despite the slight tremor she had glimpsed yesterday when Vivian had reached for the door handle. The camellia was not perfect. Some of the petals were uneven, and the stem curved a little too far to the left. But there was something in the way it was drawn, something careful and deliberate, that made Vivian pause. "Who drew this?" Vivian asked, not low. "Think up on." "I did, last night." Grace hesitated. "I know it's not very good. I'm not an artist, but I thought maybe you could use it as a reference, or change it however you need to. I just—" She stopped, realizing she was rambling, and pressed her lips together. Vivian finally looked at her. There was something in her eyes that Grace could not read, something that flickered and then was gone. "The lines are shaky," she said, "but the intention is clear. That matters more than technical skill." Grace blinked, surprised by the unexpected kindness buried inside the criticism. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Sit down." Vivian gestured toward the tattoo chair in the corner. "I need to see the placement before I decide if this is feasible." Grace's heart stuttered. She had not expected to get this far. Yesterday, she had been told to find another shop. Today, she was being invited to sit in the chair. She walked over and sat down carefully, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from trembling. Vivian pulled on a fresh pair of gloves and walked around behind her. "I need to look at the existing tattoo. Is that okay?" "Yes." Grace's voice came out smaller than she intended. She felt Vivian's fingers brush the collar of her shirt, lifting the fabric just enough to expose the nape of her neck and the top of her shoulder blade. The touch was clinical, impersonal, but Grace felt a shiver run down her spine anyway. She held very still. "The name is here," Vivian said, her voice low and focused. "Right below the shoulder blade. It's well done. Whoever did it knew what they were doing." "Alex picked the artist," Grace said. "She said she wanted it to be beautiful because it was permanent." Vivian's hands stilled for a moment, then continued its examination. "And now, they weren't turned into a flower." "Yes, because I don't want to erase her. I just want to make something new out of what she left behind." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them had expected. Vivian withdrew her hand and stepped back. When Grace turned to look at her, Vivian's face had shifted, the professional mask back in place, but her jaw was tight and she was not meeting Grace's eyes. "The camellia will work," Vivian said. "The shape fits the curve of the shoulder blade, but it will take multiple sessions. This is not a quick cover-up." "I understand. Are you sure? Because once I start, there's no going back. The name will be gone under the ink. You won't be able to change your mind." Grace looked at her, and for the first time since she walked in, she felt something solid settle in her chest. "I've spent a year thinking about this. I know what I'm giving up, and I know what I'm gaining." Vivian studied her for a long moment, Then she nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement. Okay, we start Friday, same time. She turned away and walked back to the counter, picking up her mug as if the conversation was over. But as Grace gathered her sketchbook and stood up, she noticed something. On the counter, next to the register, was a small mug of tea that had not been there before. It was still steaming, and it smelled like ginger. Grace looked at it, then at Vivian's back. Vivian was very pointedly not looking at her, her shoulders stiff, her hand wrapped around her own coffee mug. "Thank you for giving me a chance," Grace said quietly. Vivian did not turn around. "Don't thank me yet. The hard part hasn't started." But when Grace reached the door and glanced back one last time, she saw Vivian's reflection in the
Vos, pleeps, the Adiblis, the man, was looking at the sketchbook, and her expression was softer than anything Grace had seen on her face all morning. Grace stepped out into the Los Angeles sunshine and let out a breath she had been holding for the past 20 minutes. The camellia was still just a sketch in her notebook, but for the first time in a year, the name on her shoulder felt like it was already starting to fade. The buzz of the tattoo machine filled the small room like a heartbeat. Grace lay on her stomach on the leather chair, her face turned toward the wall, her right shoulder bare. She had folded her sweater into a neat square and placed it on the stool beside her, the way a child folds their clothes before a doctor's visit. Vivian's voice came from somewhere above her left shoulder. "I'm going to start with the outline. It'll take about 40 minutes. If you need a break, say so. Don't be a hero." "I won't," Grace said, and then immediately added, I'll say something if I need to. I'm not trying to be difficult." "You're not being difficult. You're being a client." Vivian's tone was flat, but there was something almost gentle beneath it. Deep breath. The first pass feels the worst. The needle touched Grace's skin, and she inhaled sharply. It was not like she remembered. The tattoo she had gotten at 23 had been a quick, impulsive thing, done in a cramped shop on Hollywood Boulevard by a man who had not asked her name. This was different. This was precise, deliberate, and somehow intimate. The machine humming a low note as Vivian's gloved hand moved in steady practice arcs. For the first few minutes, Grace focused on the pain. It was a bright, burning sensation, not unbearable, but impossible to ignore. She counted the beats of the machine, then switched to counting her own breaths. In, out, in, out. The rhythm steadied her. "Your breathing is evening out," Vivian said, not looking up. "Good, you're doing fine." The compliment, small as it was, loosened something in Grace's chest. She let her eyes drift closed and tried to surrender to the process. The room smelled like antiseptic and clean linen, with a faint undertone of something floral. Lavender, maybe, from the small diffuser on the counter. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said, her voice muffled against the chair's paper covering. Vivian's hand paused for half a second. "You can ask." "Why did you change your mind? About the name, you said you don't do names." The machine kept buzzing, but Vivian did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was carefully neutral. "Because you weren't asking me to cover it up. You were asking me to transform it. That's different." Grace felt the words settle somewhere deep, like a stone dropped into still water. She wanted to ask more, but something in Vivian's tone told her the door had closed for now. So she let the silence return, punctuated only by the hum of the needle and the occasional soft instruction to turn her head slightly or relax her shoulder. It was during one of these adjustments, when Vivian's hand pressed gently against Grace's shoulder blade to reposition her, that Grace saw it. Vivian's high collar had shifted, just slightly, revealing a thin, pale scar running diagonally across her right shoulder. It was old, faded to a silvery white, but the texture of it was unmistakable. That was not a surgical scar. That was the kind of scar left by a tattoo that had been removed. Grace's breath caught. She did not mean to stare, but her eyes lingered on the mark for a moment too long. Vivian not iced. Her hand stilled, and she pulled the collar back into place without a word. Neither of them spoke, but the air in the room shifted, thickened with something unspoken. "That must have hurt," Grace said quietly before she could stop herself. Vivian's jaw tightened. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she picked up the machine again and resumed her work, her voice flat and controlled. "It was a long time ago." Grace did not push. She closed her eyes and let the pain of the needle ground her, pulling her back from the edge of the question she wanted to ask. Who had done that to her? What had it meant? But she had learned, in 5 years of loving someone who never really saw her, that some questions could not be asked out loud. Some doors had to be opened from the inside. The outline took 38 minutes. When Vivienne finally set down the machine and stepped back, Grace's shoulder was buzzing with a dull, pleasant ache. The camellia was taking shape, a delicate network of lines that promised something beautiful. "That's it for today," Vivienne said, peeling off her gloves with a practiced snap. "It'll be sore tonight. Keep it clean, don't scratch, and come back in 2 weeks for the shading." Grace sat up slowly, careful not to jostle her new ink. She reached for her sweater, then paused. "Thank you for doing this, for giving me a chance to turn it into something different." Vivienne was already at the counter, washing her hands. She did not turn around, but her voice was quieter than usual. "You're welcome, Grace." The sound of her name, spoken in that low, careful voice, sent a small shiver down Grace's spine. She pulled on her sweater and gathered her things, pausing at the door. The small counter near the entrance held a jar of pens, a stack of boozin, fix cards, and a cardboard sleeve with a paper cup inside. The cup was still warm when Grace touched it. She glanced at the label, written in neat marker, ginger tea. She remembered then. The first day she had come in, Vivienne had mentioned to Dana that she preferred ginger tea to coffee, something about the heat being easier on her stomach. It had been an offhand comment, almost an aside. Grace had filed it away without thinking, the way she filed away all the small details about people she cared about. She did not know what made her do it. Maybe it was the scar on Vivienne's shoulder, or the careful way she had said Grace's name, or just the simple fact that someone in this room had given her something she had not known how to ask for. Grace pulled a clean napkin from the dispenser, scribbled a quick note on it with the pen from the jar, and folded it around the cup. Then she set the cup back on the counter, where it would be impossible to miss, and slipped out the door without a sound. Dana found the cup an hour later when she came in to close up. She held it up, read the napkin, and let out a low whistle. "Boss, you've got a secret admirer." Vivienne was at the back, cleaning her station. She did not look up. "What are you talking about?" "Someone left you a ginger tea. And a note." Dana waved the napkin. "It says, 'For the person who makes things beautiful, hope today is gentle with you.'" "No name." Vivienne's hands stilled. She set down the cleaning cloth and walked over to the counter, where the paper cup sat, still faintly warm. She took the napkin from Dana and read it. The handwriting was neat, unhurried, a little round, the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who took their time. She did not say anything. She folded the napkin carefully, slipped it into the pocket of her apron, and picked up the cup. Dana watched her with raised eyebrows, but wisely said nothing. That night, after Dana had gone home and the studio was dark, Vivienne sat at the front desk with the cup of now cold ginger tea beside her. She opened the appointment book and turned to the page with Grace Whitmore's name. The next session was in 2 weeks. Grace had written her phone number in the margin in that same neat, round handwriting. Vivienne traced the numbers with her fingertip. Then she closed the book, turned off the lamp, and sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on Sunset Boulevard. She did not throw the cup away. She left it on the counter, where it stayed until the next morning when Dana found it and placed it in the recycling bin without a word. Chapter 4. Unexpected ink text. 2 weeks passed like a slow exhale. Grace told herself she was not counting the days, but her calendar had a small flower drawn on the appointment date, and she had chosen her softest sweater that morning. The pale blue one with a rounded collar that always made her feel like herself. Velvet rose tattoo smelled the same, like antiseptic and sandalwood and something faintly metallic. The bell above the door chimed and Dana looked up from the front desk with a grin that was entirely too knowing. "There she is," Dana said, sliding a clipboard across the counter. "Viv's already setting up in the back. She's been weird all morning, by the way. Kept checking the clock." Grace felt her cheeks warm.
Maybe she has other appointments. She has exactly one appointment today. Dana's grin widened. Yours. The curtain to the back studio parted before Grace could respond. Vivienne stood there in her usual black apron, hair pulled back, the half glove on her right hand already in place. She looked at Grace for a moment longer than necessary, then nodded once. "You're on time," Vivienne said. It was not quite a compliment, but it was not a criticism either. Grace followed her into the back room, where the tattoo chair was already reclined and the machine was laid out on a sterile tray. The afternoon light came through the high window, casting long rectangles across the floor. Billie Holiday was singing somewhere from a small speaker on the shelf, her voice low and honeyed. "You like Billie Holiday?" Grace asked before she could stop herself. Vivienne adjusted the needle cartridge without looking up. Dana picked the record. "She picked it because you like it," Grace said softly. For a fraction of a second, Vivienne's hands stilled. Then she set the cartridge down and finally looked at Grace, her expression unreadable. "Lie down. We're outlining the petals today." Grace settled onto the chair, turning onto her side as she had learned the first time. The position was familiar now, the paper towel crinkling beneath her cheek, the faint hum of the machine warming up. She heard Vivienne roll her stool closer, felt the cool brush of gloved fingers against her shoulder as the collar of her sweater was carefully adjusted. "The outline is going to be the longest session," Vivienne said, her voice low and focused. "The shading comes later. You'll need to stay still." "I can do that. You said that last time, and then you flinched twice." "The second one was your fault. You hit the spot near my spine." Vivienne made a sound that might have been a breath of laughter, or might have been the machine clicking on. Grace could not tell, and she did not dare look. The first touch, oh, think. This needle was a sharp, familiar sting. Grace closed her eyes and let herself breathe through it, the way she had learned. Vivienne worked in silence, her movements precise and unhurried, and Grace found herself drifting into a rhythm, the pain becoming almost meditative. Then the door swung open. "Coffee delivery," Dana announced, bursting in with 2 cups in her hands. "And by coffee, I mean tea, for the lady who's allergic to caffeine. And by tea, I mean the ginger thing Viv told me to— Oh." She stopped short. Vivienne had pulled back the instant the door opened, and Grace had instinctively sat up, clutching her sweater to her chest. They were at least 2 feet apart, but the air between them felt charged like the static after a storm. Dana looked from Vivienne's carefully blank face to Grace's flushed one. A slow, delighted grin spread across her features. "Ay, Dios mío," she said, setting the cups down on the counter. "You two are killing me." "Out," Vivienne said flatly. I'm going. Dana backed out of the room with her hands up, but her eyes were sparkling. "Just so you know, the door was open. I knocked. That counts." The curtain swished closed. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Grace pulled her sweater back into place, her fingers clumsy. "I should have—" she started. "It's fine," Vivienne said, but her voice was slightly rougher than before. She picked up the machine again, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then Grace shifted on the chair, and her sweater slipped off her shoulder again, the pale blue fabric sliding down to expose the freshly outlined petals of the camellia, still red and raised. Vivienne reached out automatically to adjust it, her gloved fingers brushing the bare skin of Grace's collarbone. They both froze. Think touch lasted less than a second. Vivienne's hand withdrew as if burned, and she turned away to adjust the machine, her jaw tight. Grace lay very still, her heart hammering against her ribs, the spot where those fingers had touched still tingling. "Sorry," Grace whispered. "Don't apologize." Vivienne's voice was clipped. She cleared her throat and turned back, the mask of professional composure firmly in place. "We're not done with the outline. Lie back down." Grace obeyed. The needle resumed its work, but something had shifted in the room, like a chord that had changed key. Billie Holiday had moved on to a slower song, her voice curling through the air like smoke. When the session was over, Vivienne wiped the fresh ink with a clean cloth and applied a thin layer of ointment. Her movements were efficient, but her fingers lingered a moment longer than necessary on the edge of the bandage.
That's it for today, she said, straightening up. 2 more sessions for the shading. Then the final touches. Grace sat up carefully, testing the ache in her shoulder. She looked at Vivian, who was already cleaning the machine. Her back turned. "Thank you," Grace said. "For the tea. Dana said you asked her to get it." Vivian's shoulders stiffened, but she did not turn around. "Dana talks too much. She said you remembered." "I remember a lot of things." Vivian's voice was quiet, almost to herself. Then she turned, and for a moment the hardness in her eyes softened into something Grace could not name. "Take care of it. No scratching, no sun, no swimming for a week." "I know the instructions." "Then why are you still standing there?" Grace smiled, small and tentative. "Because I wanted to say goodbye before I left." Vivian said nothing. Her fingers closed around the edge of his train knuckles white. Then very softly she said, "Goodbye, Grace." Grace's name in Vivian's mouth sounded different than it did anywhere else. It sounded like something being held carefully. She walked out of the studio with her hand pressed to her collarbone, where the ghost of a touch still lingered, and she did not look back. Dana was at the front desk, doing a very poor job of pretending she had not been eavesdropping. She caught Grace's eye and gave her a thumbs up. "See you in 2 weeks?" Dana asked. Grace paused at the door. "Yes, in 2 weeks." She stepped out into the Los Angeles sunshine, and the bell chimed behind her. Through the window, she saw Dano turn and say something to the back curtain, and a moment later, Vivian's silhouette appeared, watching her walk away. Grace turned the corner, pressed her back against the brick wall, and let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. The camellia on her shoulder throbbed with a sweet, dull ache, and she pressed her palm over it, feeling the warmth of her own skin. Somewhere in the studio, she knew, Billie Holiday was still singing. She walked home the long way, past the murals and the coffee shops and the old theater with its faded marquee, and she did not once feel lost. Grace arrived 45 minutes early. She told herself it was because the bus ran faster than usual, or because she wanted to stop for a coffee she knew she should not drink. But the truth was simpler. She could not sit still in her apartment another minute. The camellia on her shoulder had stopped aching, and somehow that made it worse. It felt like the flower was waiting for something. She turned the corner onto the studio's block and stopped. The back gate of velvet rose tattoo was open, and Vivian was crouched in the thin patch of concrete behind the building, her back to the street. She was holding a tin bowl of something that smelled like tuna, and a small 3-colored cat was winding between her boots, purring loud enough to hear from where Grace stood. Vivian's shoulders were loose. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft and completely unguarded. "Yeah, I know. You already ate. You just wanted to see if I'd come out anyway." The cat meowed. Vivian laughed, a low, quiet sound Grace had never heard before. Grace's chest tightened. She knew she should announce herself, should clear her throat, should do something to stop watching a moment that felt private, but she could not move. She stood very still, holding her breath, watching the woman who drew perfect lines on strangers' skin crouch in the dust and talk to a stray cat like it was the most important conversation she would have all day. The cat noticed her first, its ears swiddled, and it looked past Vivian with the unblinking stare of small predators everywhere. Vivian turned, and her face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. Soft, startled, then carefully blank. "You're early," she said. Her voice was flat, but her hands moved quickly, setting the bowl down and brushing her knees off. "I'm sorry," Grace said. "I didn't mean to. I can wait outside. I'll come back." "No." Vivian stood. The cat, Miso, Grace remembered, rocked against her ankle, and she nudged it gently with the toe of her boot. "It's fine. She's not mine. She just stays." Grace heard the echo of her own words from somewhere deep in her chest. "Sometimes the ones who stay are the ones who choose us." She had said it without thinking, and Vivian had not answered. Now she watched Vivian look down at the cat with something that looked almost like longing. And she understood that some things did not need to be said twice. "I like your cat," Grace said quietly. "She's not," Vivian started, then stopped. She sighed. "Yeah, I like her too." They walked into the studio through the back door, and the air inside was cool and smelled like antiseptic and lavender. Vivienne gestured to the chair and Grace settled onto it, resting her forearms on her thighs. She could feel the heat rising from her own skin, and she hoped her face was not as red as it felt. "Ready?" Vivienne asked. She was pulling on her gloves, her movements efficient, but her eyes flicked to Grace's face and then away, like she was checking for something. "Ready?" Grace said. The session was quiet. Vivienne worked on the camellia's petals with a focus that bordered on reverence, and Grace closed her eyes and let herself feel the vibration of the needle, the press of Vivienne's gloved fingers against her shoulder blade. She had stopped flinching at the touch. She had started, instead, to lean into it. It was not until Vivienne paused to change the needle tip that Grace's phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She ignored it. It buzzed again, and again. "You should check that," Vivienne said, not looking up. "It's fine," Grace said. "It can wait." It buzzed a fourth time, and Vivienne set down the machine and looked at her with an expression that was not quite annoyance and not quite concern. "Grace, check it." Grace pulled out her phone. The screen was bright with a preview of the message, and she read it in one terrible instant, the words not registering until she had already absorbed the shape of them. "You're still invited. I know it's weird, but it wouldn't feel right without you. Please come. Alex." The wedding date. The venue. A little heart he was like a knife twist wrapped in pink. Grace's hand went cold. She stared at the screen, and the room seemed to tilt, and she heard herself say, in a voice that sounded like someone else's, "I'm sorry. I have to go." She was off the chair before she knew she had moved. Her jacket was in her hand, and she was halfway to the door when Vivienne said, "Grace, stop." She stopped. Vivienne had pulled off her gloves. She was standing very still, her hands at her sides, and her voice was quieter than Grace had ever heard it. "Don't run. That's the first thing they want you to do. Don't run." Grace's throat closed. "I don't know how to not run." Vivienne crossed the room. She did not touch her, but she stood close enough that Grace could feel the warmth of her. "Come with me," she said. "Just for a minute. The backyard, it's calmer out there." She led her through the back door, and the afternoon light was golden and soft, and Miso was still there, curled up on a patch of sun-warmed concrete. Vivienne sat down on the step, and after a moment, Grace sat beside her. "I got one of these too," Vivienne said. "Wedding invitation. But it was for her new life without me." Her voice was steady, but her hands were clasped tight in her lap. "I didn't go. I wanted to, just to prove I could, but I didn't." Grace looked at her. "Did it help?" "No," Vivienne said. "But I fed the cat instead. And that helped a little." Miso got up, patted over and butted her head against Grace's knee. Grace reached down and touched the soft fur, and the cat purred, and she felt something in her chest loosen just slightly. "Are you still scared?" Grace asked quietly. Vivienne was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Every day. But I still feed the cat." Grace laughed. A wet sound that surprised her. Vivienne looked at her, and there was something in her eyes that Grace had not seen before. It was not pity. It was not distance. It was something like recognition. "Your line work's not finished," Vivienne said. "Don't quit halfway." Grace looked down at the cat, at the warm concrete, at the woman beside her who had just told her the truest thing she had heard in months. "I won't," she said. "I'll come back." "Good," Vivienne said, and then so quietly Grace almost missed it. "I'll be here." They sat in the sun until Grace's phone buzzed again, and this time she turned it face down without looking. The wedding invitation sat on Grace's nightstand like a small, poisonous thing. She had not opened the full card, but the envelope was thick, cream-colored, addressed in Alex's careful handwriting. Grace had read her own name on it 5 times before she put it down. Alexandra Whitmore. No. Alexandra had never taken her name. The envelope simply said, Grace. And that was somehow worse. She did not go to the shop that week. She told herself it was because the shop needed extra inventory counts,
because the landlord had sent another notice about the rent, because the weather was bad. She told herself a lot of things, but at night she lay awake staring at the ceiling, and she heard Vivienne's voice. "Don't quit halfway." She had promised to come back. She had promised. On the third day, she canceled her appointment. The message was short and bright. "So sorry, something came up. Can I reschedule?" She sent it at 9:14 in the morning, and by 9:20 she was already regretting it. But the reply did not come from Dana. It came from Vivienne's number, the one Grace had never saved but now knew by heart. "Your line work's not finished. Don't quit halfway." Grace stared at the screen. Her foot hovered over the keyboard. She typed and deleted 3 replies. Finally, she wrote, "I know, I'm sorry, I just," and stopped. She could not finish the sentence. She did not know how to say that the thought of lying on that chair again, with the needle tracing new shapes over old scars, felt like a confession she was not ready to make. She did not expect a reply. But 20 minutes later, her phone buzzed again. Vivienne had written only 4 words. "Come anyway. No needle today." The drive to Silver Lake took 22 minutes. Grace made it in 18, then sat in her car outside the studio for another 10, gripping the steering wheel. When she finally walked in, Dana was not at the front desk. The studio was quiet, the lights dimmed low. Vivienne sat on the stool near the tattoo chair, holding a mug of tea. She did not look up when the bell chimed. "I told you, no needle today," she said, "but I figured you could use some tea." Grace's throat tightened. She walked over and sat on the edge of the chair, not lying down, just sitting, like a guest who did not know if she was welcome. Vivienne slid a second mug toward her. It was not coffee. It was ginger tea, the kind Grace had left outside the door weeks ago. "You remembered," Grace said quietly. "I remember things that matter," Vivienne said. She said it like she was remarking on the weather, but her fingers tightened around her own mug. "So, the invitation?" Grace flinched. "How did you—" "You canceled 3 appointments. You're not the type to flake. Something happened." Vivienne finally looked up. Her eyes were steady, but there was no judgment in them. "You don't have to tell me." "But you came anyway." Grace took a breath. The tea was warm in her hands, grounding her. She sent a wedding invitation. "Alex. She's getting married in Malibu in October. She wants me to watch her marry the woman she left me for." The words hung in the air, ugly and raw. Grace waited for Vivienne to say something comforting, something professional, something that would let her pretend this was normal. But Vivienne just nodded slowly. "Are you going to go?" "I don't know," Grace admitted. "Part of me wants to. Not because I want her back, but because I think I need to see it to believe it's really over." Does that make sense? "It makes more sense than you think." Vivienne set her mug down. "I got an invitation once. From someone who left. I didn't go. I thought if I stayed away, it would hurt less. It did, eventually." She paused, and her voice dropped. "But I also didn't get to say goodbye to that part of my life. I just stopped showing up." Grace studied her. "Do you regret it?" Vivienne was quiet for a long time. The clock on the wall ticked. Finally, she said, "I regret not knowing what I wanted. I was so busy being afraid of the pain that I never asked myself what I was hoping for." She looked at Grace. "So, I'll ask you. What are you hoping for? If you go, what do you want to happen?" Grace closed her eyes. The answer came unbidden and clear. "I want to know I'm done. I want to stand in a room full of people who think she's happy, and I want to feel nothing. Not anger, not grief, just nothing. Because I'll already be somewhere else." "Then you already know the answer," Vivienne said. "You just don't trust yourself to know it yet." Grace opened her eyes. Vivienne was still looking at her, and there was something in that gaze she could not name. It was not pity. It was not distance. It was something like belief. It was the same look Vivienne had given her in the backyard, when she had said she was scared but still fed the cat. It was a look that said, "I see you, and I'm not going anywhere." "Vivienne," Grace said, and the name felt new in her mouth, like a stone worn smooth by water. "Why did you send me that message? You could have just canceled my appointment and moved on." Vivienne's jaw tightened. For a moment, Grace thought she had crossed a line. But then Vivienne said very quietly, "Because I don't want you to quit halfway. Not on the tattoo, not on yourself."
She picked up her mug and took a sip, and when she spoke again, her voice was steady. "And maybe because I'm not done with you yet either." The words landed like a gentle hand on Grace's chest. She did not know what to say, so she said nothing. She just sat there, in the quiet studio, holding her tea, letting the words settle into her bones. "Come on," Vivian said after a while. She stood and walked to the tattoo chair, patting the leather. "No needle, but I want to show you something." Grace followed her. On the chair, Vivian had laid out a sheet of paper. It was a sketch, unfinished, in pencil. It was a flower, but not the camellia. It was a small, delicate thing, with petals that opened outward like a compass rose. "For the shop," Vivian said, her voice carefully neutral. "I've been thinking about a new design. I wanted your opinion." Grace looked at the sketch, then at Vivian. "It's beautiful," she said. "It looks like a beginning." Vivian's lips curved, just slightly, almost a smile. "That's what I thought too." They stood together in the dim light, looking at the small flower that pointed in every direction. And for the first time since the invitation arrived, Grace felt the weight in her chest ease. She did not know what was growing between them, but she knew, with a quiet certainty, that she was not going to quit halfway. The week after the wedding invitation conversation, Grace found herself looking at the shop's lease agreement more often than she wanted to. The landlord had sent a notice, polite but firm. Rent would increase by 40% starting next quarter. She had done the math 3 times. Each time, the numbers stared back at her, unblinking. Impossible. She told herself it was fine. She told herself she would figure it out. She told herself this the way she always did, the way she had told herself that Alex would come home early, that Alex would stop texting that woman from work, that Alex would look at her the way she used to. The words meant nothing now. They had meant nothing then either. On Thursday morning, she mentioned it to Vivian without meaning to. They were sitting in the studio's back room during a break, the smell of antiseptic and ink fading into the background. Grace had brought 2 cups of tea, and Vivian had accepted hers without comment, which Grace had learned was the closest thing to gratitude she ever showed. "The shop might not make it," Grace said, staring into her cup. "The rent increase. I've been trying to find a way, but it's not enough. I've been open for 6 years. I don't know what I'd do if it closed." Vivian was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was low and even, like she was choosing each word carefully. "What would you do?" "I don't know," Grace admitted. "I've never done anything else. I mean, I've worked other jobs, but the shop is the first thing that felt like mine. The first thing I built by myself, for myself. And now it's slipping away, and I don't have anyone to blame but the economy and bad timing." "That's not blame," Vivian said. "That's just circumstance." Things looked up. Vivian was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something soft at the edges. "What do you mean?" "I mean, sometimes things fall apart because the world is heavy, not because you drop them." Vivian set her tea down and leaned back in her chair. "You've been holding that shop up for 6 years. That's not nothing. That's endurance." "Endurance?" Grace repeated, tasting the word. "You said that before. When I was upset about the wedding. I meant it then. I mean it now." Grace felt something warm spread through her chest, separate from the tea. She looked down at her hands, at the calluses from years of hauling boxes of books, the small paper cuts that never quite healed. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for saying that, for listening. I know I've been a lot lately." "You haven't been a lot," Vivian said. "You've been human. There's a difference." It was such a simple thing to say, and yet Grace felt her eyes sting. She blinked rapidly, pretending to study the grain of the wooden table. When she looked up, Vivian was still watching her, and there was something unguarded in her face, something that made Grace's breath catch. "I should get back to work," Grace said, standing up too quickly. Her chair scraped against the floor. "I have a shipment coming in this afternoon." Vivian nodded but didn't move. "Grace." Grace paused at the door, looking back. "If the shop doesn't make it," Vivian said slowly, "it won't be because you didn't try. You're not someone who quits halfway." Grace felt her heart squeeze. "Neither are you," she said. "I've seen you work. You finish every line you start." Vivian's lips twitched. Almost every line. There was something in her voice, a thread of meaning that Grace couldn't quite grasp. For before she could ask, Vivian looked away, reaching for her tea, and the moment dissolved into the comfortable silence they had built between them. That night, Grace closed the shop at 8, exhausted and discouraged. She had called 3 commercial lenders. All 3 had declined. She had emailed her landlord asking for a meeting and received an automated response. She sat on the floor of the bookstore, surrounded by boxes of new arrivals she hadn't had the heart to unpack, and let herself feel the weight of it. Her phone buzzed. A notification for her bank. A large deposit had been made into her business account. The amount was enough to cover 6 months of the new rent. The sender was listed as Anonymous Benefactor. Grace stared at the screen, her heart pounding. She refreshed the page. The deposit was still there. She refreshed it again. Still there. It didn't make sense. She hadn't applied for a grant. She hadn't asked anyone for help. She hadn't told anyone except Vivian. And Vivian was a tattoo artist, not a philanthropist. She called Dana the next morning, mostly because she didn't know who else to call. "Someone just deposited a huge amount of money into my business account," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't know who or why. Is this a scam? Is this a mistake?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Dana said, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound casual, "Ay, Dios mío, that's crazy. Have you tried calling the bank? I called them this morning. They said the transaction was legitimate and the sender requested anonymity." "Wow," Dana said. "That's so weird. Maybe you have a secret admirer." "Dana, this is serious. I'm taking it seriously. I'm just saying, people do nice things sometimes. Maybe someone really believes in some—" "Your bookstore?" Grace frowned. "How did you know it was about the bookstore?" Another pause. Then Dana laughed, a little too loudly. "You literally just told me about the rent increase, remember? On Monday. I'm your friend, Grace. I listen." Grace felt a flicker of suspicion, but she let it go. "I guess. It's just so strange. Who would do that? I don't know anyone with that kind of money." "Maybe you do, and you don't know you know them," Dana said. "Anyway, I have a client in 10 minutes. I gotta go. But Grace, congratulations. Your books are safe." The call ended. Grace sat in her office, staring at the numbers on her screen, a strange feeling blooming in her chest. It wasn't the relief she had expected. It was something quieter, more complicated. Someone had seen her struggling and had chosen to help. Not because she had asked, not because she had earned it, just because. On Friday, she went to the studio for her next session. The camellia was nearly complete, the petals curling around the old letters, transforming them into something new. Vivian worked in silence, her gloved fingers steady against Grace's shoulder. It was intimate, this proximity, the warmth of Vivian's breath against her skin, the careful pressure of the needle. "I still can't figure out who sent that money," Grace said, her voice muffled against the headrest. "I've been going through everyone I know. No one has that kind of cash just lying around." Vivian didn't look up. Maybe someone wanted to invest in something they believed in. Maybe. Grace turned her head slightly, catching a glimpse of Vivian's profile, the focused line of her jaw. "It's just weird. I told you about the rent, and then suddenly someone pays it. Like magic." "Not magic," Vivian said. "Just generosity. Sometimes people do things without expecting anything back." "You sound like you know something." Vivian's hand paused, just for a second, then she resumed, her voice even. "I know that good things deserve to be believed in, that's all." Grace felt her heart do something strange, a flutter she couldn't name. She closed her eyes and let the steady hum of the tattoo machine fill the silence. The last petal was almost done, the flower was almost complete. When it was finished, Vivian wiped the area clean and stepped back. "All done," she said. "Give it a few weeks to heal, then it'll be perfect." Grace sat up carefully, twisting to look at her shoulder in the mirror. The camellia was beautiful, delicate and full, the lines crisp and clean. The old name was gone, hidden beneath the petals, reshaped into something that belonged to her now. She felt tears prick her eyes. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It was already beautiful," Vivian said. "I just helped it become what it was meant to be." Grace looked at her, at the careful stillness of her posture, the way her eyes refused to meet Grace's, and she understood, with a certainty that surprised her, that the anonymous deposit and the careful words were connected. She didn't know how she knew. She just did. "Thank you," she said softly. "For everything." Vivian finally met her eyes. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Vivian nodded once and turned away. "Same time next week," she said. "There's one more thing I want to show you." Grace smiled, small and tentative. "I'll be here." The week passed in a blur of quiet mornings and restless nights. Grace rearranged the front display of the bookstore 3 times, unable to settle on anything. The camellia on her shoulder had stopped itching, settling into her skin like had always belonged there. She caught herself touching it through her shirt, pressing her palm flat against the petals as if checking that it was still real. The anonymous deposit still sat in her account. She had not touched it. She had told herself it was a loan, a gift from some unseen patron who believed in small bookstores and the people who ran them. But a part of her kept circling back to Vivian's voice, low and careful, saying good things deserve to be believed in. The words had lodged themselves under her skin like a second tattoo. She arrived at Velvet Rose Tattoo exactly on time. The door was unlocked, the front room empty. A single lamp burned near the consultation desk, casting a warm pool of light across the worn leather chair. The usual hum of the sterilization machine was absent. The shop felt suspended, holding its breath. "Back here," Vivian's voice came from the studio doorway. She was leaning against the frame, arms crossed, but her posture was looser than Grace had ever seen it. She had taken off the black taff gloves. Her right hand rested bare against her left elbow, fingers still, steady. Grace walked toward her, heartbeat quickening for reasons she refused to name. "You said there was something you wanted to show me." Vivian nodded once and turned, leading her into the back studio. The lights were dimmed. On the work table, under a single focused lamp, lay a sheet of paper. Grace stepped closer and saw it was a sketch, carefully drawn in fine black ink. A stylized compass rose, its needle pointing northeast, surrounded by delicate petals that looked almost like a camellia in bloom. "It's beautiful," Grace said softly. "Did you draw this?" "I did. A while ago." Vivian's voice was quiet, almost reluctant. "I don't usually show my own sketch. They're not for clients, but I thought you might understand it." Grace looked up. "Understand what?" Vivian was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached up and, very slowly, pulled the collar of her shirt aside. On her right shoulder, just above the collarbone, was a scar. It was pale and slightly raised, in a regular patch of skin where a tattoo had been removed. The shape was still faintly visible beneath the scar tissue. A rose. Grace's breath caught. She had glimpsed it before. The time she had said that must have hurt. But she had never seen it fully, never understood what it was. Now she did. "You asked me once," Vivian said, her voice barely above a whisper, "why I stopped doing names. This is why. I put this on myself for someone who promised me forever. And then she asked me to take it off." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and raw. Grace felt her throat tighten. She wanted to reach out and touch the scar, to press her palm against it the way she pressed against her own camellia. But she held herself still. "What was her name?" Grace asked quietly. Vivian pulled her collar back into place. "Elena." The name came out flat, emptied of emotion. "She said the rose was our promise. Then she broke the promise and asked me to erase the evidence. So I did. I sat in this very chair and let a colleague laser it off because I couldn't stand to look at it anymore." The silence that followed was thick, almost liquid. Grace could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the corner, the distant sound of a car passing on Sunset Boulevard. She looked at Vivian, at the careful blankness of her face, and she understood that this was a story Vivian did not tell, not to anyone. "I'm sorry," Grace said. "That must have been unbearable." It was what it was. Vivian's voice was steady, but her hands had begun to tremble. She noticed Grace looking and quickly shoved them into her pockets. "I told you I don't keep promises I can't make, so I stopped making them. Easier that way." Grace stepped closer, slow and deliberate, giving Vivian every chance to step away. She didn't. When Grace was close enough to see the faint lines at the corners of Vivian's eyes, she reached out and gently took one of Vivian's hands from her pocket. The trembling was unmistakable now, the fingers fine-boned and tense against Grace's palm.
Vivian, she said softly. You don't have to keep someone else's broken promise, but you're allowed to make your own. You're allowed to believe in something new. Vivian looked at her, and something in her face cracked, just slightly, like ice beginning to thaw at the edges. And what if I don't know how anymore? You already do, Grace said. You drew a compass rose. You showed it to me. That's not someone who stopped believing. That's someone who's been waiting for a good reason to start again. Vivian's hand turned under Grace's, their fingers interlocking for just a moment. Then she pulled away gently and stepped back. Her voice when she spoke was rough but steady. You should go. It's late. Grace nodded, understanding. She picked up her bag and walked toward the door. At the threshold, she paused and looked back. Vivian was standing under the lamp, her bare hand resting on the sketch, her head bowed. Same time next week? Grace asked. Vivian looked up. Her eyes were bright, but she was not crying. Yes. The flower needs one last session to seal the final petal. And then, she trailed off, her gaze dropping to the compass. Maybe we can talk about what comes after the ink dries. Grace smiled, small and warm. I'd like Pat. She stepped out into the cool Los Angeles night, her heart full of a feeling she was finally ready to name. The bell above the studio door chimed at exactly 10 in the morning. Grace stepped inside, and the smell of ink and antiseptic wrapped around her like a familiar coat. She had been here a dozen times now, but today her chest felt tight in a way it had not before. Vivian was already at her station, laying out fresh needles and a small pot of black ink. She looked up when Grace entered, and for a moment, something soft flickered across her face. Then it was gone, replaced by the calm, focused mask Grace had come to know. You're early. I wanted to make sure I didn't lose my nerve, Grace admitted, setting her bag down on the chair by the door. She pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges from being handled too many times. I brought something. For you? Vivian's eyebrows rose slightly, but she did not ask. She just held out her hand, and Grace placed the paper in her palm. It was warm from being carried close. Vivian unfolded it carefully, the way someone might handle a letter they were afraid to break. The sketch showed a small compass, but not the kind you bought in a shop. The needle was shaped like a flower stem, the cardinal points etched as tiny petals. Around the outer ring, a delicate line of script read, "To find your way back to yourself." Vivian stared at it for a long moment. Her thumb traced the edge of the paper. Once, twice. You drew this, Vivian said. It was not a question. Grace nodded. For you. I know you said you don't do names, and I'm not asking you to ink this on anyone. I wanted you to see it. To know that someone drew something for you, with no strings attached. No promises you have to keep. Vivian's jaw tightened. She set the paper down on the counter with great care, smoothing its creases flat. When she looked up, her eyes were glassy, but her voice was steady. I showed you my scar last week. I told you about Elena, about the rose I inked on my own shoulder because I believed her when she said it would last forever. Grace stayed very still. I remember. She asked me to laser them off after she left, said she did not want her name on my skin anymore. I sat in this chair, in this studio, and I held the laser myself. Vivian's voice dropped to a whisper. The smell of my own skin burning was the last thing I felt for a long time. I told myself I was done with promises, done with trusting anyone enough to let them leave a mark on me. Grace stepped closer, not touching, just closing the distance. But you still wear the scar. Because it's part of me now, Vivian said. I can't burn it away without burning away everything I learned. Elena taught me that love can be a lie. But you... She stopped, swallowed, and started again. You came in here with a name you wanted erased, and you left with a flower. You did not ask me to fix you. You asked me to help you become something new. That is not the same thing. Grace's eyes were wet, but she was smiling. My name was not meant to be covered. It was meant to become a flower, and now it's blooming. That's because of you, Vivian. You did that. You helped me turn a scar into something that grows. Vivian looked down at her own hands, bare this time, the black gloves left in her back pocket. They were trembling, just slightly. Grace saw it, and without asking, she reached out and took Vivian's hand in both of hers.
The touch was warm, grounding, unhurried. "You do not, Hector, think to keep other people's promises," Grace said softly, "but you can make your own, and you can let someone make one with you." Vivian's breath came out shaky. She looked at the sketch again, then at Grace. "The flower still needs one final petal to seal the ink. Are you ready?" Grace nodded. "I'm ready." They moved to the chair together, the rhythm familiar now. Grace lay down, her shoulder exposed, the half-finished camellia blooming across her skin. Vivian picked up her gun, and the hum of the needle filled the room. For 20 minutes, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the soft buzz of the machine and the occasional hitch of Grace's breath as the needle traced the final curve. When it was done, Vivian set the gun down and wiped the area clean with a gentle hand. She stepped back, and Grace sat up carefully, twisting to look at her shoulder in the mirror. The camellia was complete, every petal crisp and vivid, the old name of Alexandra lost somewhere beneath layers of ink and intention. It no longer read as a scar, it read as a beginning. Grace touched the edge of the flower with her fingertips, and a small, quiet sound escaped her. Not a sob, not a laugh, but something in between. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's mine." Vivian was watching her with an expression Grace had never seen before. Open, unprotected. "Thank you for letting me be part of your new story," she said, her voice rough and low. Grace slid off the chair and stood in front of her, close enough to feel the warmth of her body. She reached out and touched the spot on Vivian's shoulder where the scar lay hidden under her shirt. "You gave me a flower. Let me give you a direction." She picked up the sketch of the compass and held it out. "Not on your skin. Not yet. But when you're Think. 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 I don't either to perceive." Vivian's eyes glistened. She took the sketch from Grace's hand, folded it carefully, and tucked it into the front pocket of her jeans over her heart. Then she looked at Grace, and for the first time she smiled. It was small, crooked, unpracticed, but it was real. "The ink's dry," Vivian said. "I think we can talk about what comes next now." Grace laughed through her tears. I'd like that a lot." A month passed like water through fingers, slow and quiet, the way healing always is when you stop watching for it. Grace's tattoo healed beautifully. The camellia on her shoulder blade bloomed in shades of deep crimson and soft pink, the petals curving over the spot where Alexandra's name had once sat like a scar. She caught herself in the bookstore's bathroom mirror sometimes, twisting to see it, and each time she felt a small, quiet surprise. It was not the absence of the old name that moved her. It was the presence of something new. The anonymous order that had saved her bookstore remained a mystery. Every month, a new box of hand-picked books arrived, paid in full, with no return address. Grace had her suspicions, but she couldn't prove anything. Dana, of course, was the one who finally broke. They were having coffee in the tattoo studio's tiny break room, and Dana was telling an elaborate story about a date who had brought her a cactus. "And he says because I'm prickly but worth the effort," Dana laughed, shaking her head. "Ay, Dios mío, men are hopeless." "Some of them," Grace said, smiling. She glanced toward the studio floor where Vivian was finishing a client's forearm piece. The black half-glove was on, as always. "Tape." Grace had started noticing the small ways Vivian's hand moved with more steadiness now. Less hesitation, more intention. "Speaking of hopeless," Dana said, lowering her voice, "you know the guy who ordered those book boxes? The ones keeping your store alive?" Grace's heart stuttered. "I've been trying to figure that out for weeks." Dana's eyes went wide, and she slapped a hand over her mouth. "Oh no. I wasn't supposed to say anything. Vivian will kill me. Actually, she'll do something worse. She'll give me the silent treatment for a week, and you know how that is." Grace set down her coffee cup very carefully. "Dana, was it her?" Dana looked at the ceiling, then at the floor, then at the ceiling again. "I'm going to plead the fifth, but if you happen to notice that the annual subscription was paid for 12 months up front, which is basically half a year's rent, and that the sender's email address might or might not be v.hartley.im4.inc@gmail.com. I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying what I'm not saying." Grace's throat tightened. She looked through the window at Vivian, who was bent over her client's arm, her face focused and calm. The woman who had refused to do names.
The woman who had said, "I don't do promises." The woman who had quietly, anonymously, believed in a struggling bookstore because, as she'd said, good things deserve to be believed in. That evening, after the studio closed, Grace walked over with a bouquet of white camellias. She didn't knock. She knew the door would be unlocked, the way it always was when Vivian was feeding Miso in the backyard. Vivian was squatting by the back steps, a bowl of food in her hand, and Miso was rubbing against her ankles with the entitled air of a cat who knew exactly who fed her. Vivian
Vacant at the sound of footsteps, and her face did something complicated, half surprise, half something softer. "You found out," she said. "Dana has a very expressive face," Grace said. She set the camellias on the table by the door. "These are for you. They match the ones on my shoulder." Vivian stood, brushing off her knees. She looked at the flowers, then at Grace, then at the flowers again. "I didn't want you to feel obligated." "The books were—" "You saved my bookstore," Grace said quietly. "You saved the place where I've spent the last 3 years rebuilding myself. And you did it without telling me, without expecting anything in return. That's not obligation, Vivian. That's exactly the opposite." Vivian's jaw tightened. She looked away, toward the fence, toward the sky, anywhere but at Grace. "I told you I don't do promises. But I can't seem to stop doing things for you." "Good," Grace said, "because I can't seem to stop doing things for you either." She stepped closer, close enough to smell the faint antiseptic of the studio and the cedar of Vivian's jacket. "You never did tell me what comes next. You said we could talk about it after the ink dried." Vivian let out a breath. It was shaky, like something she'd been holding for a long time. "I bought a motorcycle, the one from the manuals I've been hoarding for years. It's parked in the alley." Grace blinked. "You bought it?" "I've been collecting repair manuals for that exact modded for 7 years. It felt like time to stop reading about it and actually ride it." Vivian's voice dropped. "I was thinking we could take it out, catch the sunset, if you want." Grace's heart felt too big for her chest. "You want to take me on your motorcycle? On the first real date you've ever suggested?" "Don't make it weird." Vivian muttered, but the corner of her mouth twitched. They rode through the streets of Silver Lake as the sky turned amber and rose. Grace wrapped her arms around Vivian's waist, feeling the solid warmth of her through the leather jacket, the way the city blurred past them like a watercolor. The wind was loud, but Vivian's voice carried clearly when she spoke. "Grace." "Yeah?" "I've been thinking about names. You asked me once why I stopped doing them, and I told you it was because some ink is a promise I can't keep." Vivian paused. The motorcycle hummed beneath them. "But you changed something. You made me believe that maybe the right name, the right person, is worth the risk." Grace's arms tightened around her. She waited. "How about mine?" Vivian said, the words half caught by the wind. "If you're ready for a new name, I'd like it to be that." Grace pressed her cheek against the back of Vivian's jacket and smiled so wide her face ached. "Yes," she said, "yes, I'm ready." Later, after the sunset had faded to violet and the stars had begun to appear, they sat on the steps behind the studio. Miso wandered over and settled between them, as if claiming her place in the story. Grace traced her fingers along Vivian's shoulder, where she knew the scar of the washed-away rose lay hidden. "If you want," Grace said softly, "I could do yours, the compass. I've been practicing." Vivian was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached up and took Grace's hand, threading their fingers together. "You drew it. You can ink it. That feels right." Her voice was steady, her hand steady, and Grace understood that this was the truest gift Vivian could give. Not a promise spoken aloud, but a scar reclaimed, a direction chosen together. Miso yawned and stretched, and the might-lat night settled around them like a blanket. In the morning there would be ink and needles and new beginnings. But tonight there was only this. 2 women, 1 cat, and the quiet bloom of something neither of them had expected to find. It seems even the sharpest words can't hide a heart looking for home. Fellow romantics, wherever you are tonight, drop your city in the comments and tell us. Did Alexander's vulnerability catch you by surprise? If this story warmed you, hit subscribe to stay a while. Until our next tale, keep the fire burning.